Imagine losing 27 years of your life, not because you committed a crime, but because you dared to stand against injustice. Imagine watching your youth disappear behind cold prison walls, missing birthdays, missing family, missing freedom itself. Most people would break. Most people would give up. Most people would come out filled with anger and revenge. But one man did the impossible. After spending 27 years in prison, he walked out not as a broken man, but as a leader who would unite a divided nation, a leader who would become president. His name was Nelson Mandela. This is not just a story of survival. This is the story of courage, sacrifice, forgiveness, and one of the greatest comebacks in human history. This is the story of the prisoner who became president. Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in the small village of Mvezo, South Africa. At first glance, there was nothing to suggest that this young boy would one day change the course of history. He grew up in a traditional community surrounded by rolling hills, open fields, and tribal customs that had been passed down for generations. His family belonged to the Thembu royal lineage, giving him a connection to leadership from an early age. As a child, Mandela spent much of his time listening to elders tell stories around fires, stories of courage, stories of justice, stories of leaders who sacrificed everything for their people. Those stories planted a seed in his mind, a seed that would later grow into a lifelong mission. Education became one of the most important parts of his life. He believed knowledge could open doors that seemed impossible to reach. But as Mandela grew older, he began to notice something disturbing. Not everyone in South Africa was treated equally, and that realization would change his life forever. As Nelson Mandela grew older, the world around him began to change. But not in a good way. South Africa was becoming deeply divided. A system was being enforced that separated people based on the color of their skin. It was called apartheid. And under this system, the majority of the population had almost no rights. They could not vote. They could not freely move. They could not even live where they wanted. Mandela saw this injustice with his own eyes, and something inside him refused to stay silent. He began to realize something powerful. That education alone was not enough. Knowledge without action would change nothing. So Mandela joined a movement that was not about violence, but about justice, about equality, about freedom. He started speaking out, he started organizing people, and slowly, his voice began to grow stronger. But speaking against injustice always comes at a cost. The government began to watch him closely. Every step he took was monitored. Every speech he gave was recorded. He was no longer just a lawyer. He was becoming a threat to the system. And yet, Mandela did not stop. Even when fear surrounded him, even when danger was close, he chose courage because he believed something very simple, that no system of oppression can last forever. And this belief would eventually turn him into one of the most powerful symbols of resistance the world has ever seen. But power always attracts consequences. And soon, Mandela's life was about to take a dramatic turn. The more Nelson Mandela spoke, the more powerful his message became, and the more dangerous his position grew in the eyes of the government. South Africa's authorities had made one thing clear: he must be stopped. Mandela had become one of the key leaders of the resistance movement. He was organizing protests, building networks, and challenging the system at its core, but in a country ruled by fear and control. Leaders like him were not allowed to rise, so the government began a full operation to capture him. For months, Mandela moved in secrecy, changing locations, avoiding surveillance, staying one step ahead of the authorities. But in 1962, everything changed. Mandela was finally arrested. Not during a protest, not during a speech, but while traveling in disguise. A man who had become a symbol of hope was now in handcuffs. The streets fell silent with shock. Many people feared this was the end of the movement. Mandela was taken to court for trial. The government accused him of sabotage and trying to overthrow the state. The courtroom became the center of global attention. Everyone expected him to defend himself quietly or show fear. But Mandela did something unexpected. He stood firm, calm, composed, and fearless. And then came the moment that would echo through history. He delivered a speech that changed everything. A speech not of fear, but of belief. A belief in equality, a belief in justice, a belief in a free South Africa. In that courtroom, Mandela was not just defending himself, he was defending an entire nation. The judges may have had the power to decide his fate, but they could not silence his voice. And after the trial, a decision was made that would change his life forever. Nelson Mandela would be sentenced to life in prison. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom went silent. Nelson Mandela had been sentenced to life in prison. Not years, not a short punishment, but a lifetime behind bars. He was taken away from the courtroom and transported to a place that would become his world for the next 27 years. A small, isolated prison called Robben Island. The conditions were brutal. Small cell, cold floor, hard labor every single day. No comfort, no privacy, no freedom. But the hardest punishment was not physical, it was psychological. Isolation. Years passed without real human connection. Letters were limited, visits were rare. The world outside slowly became distant. Many people expected Mandela to break, to lose hope, to become bitter. But something unexpected happened. Instead of giving up, he adapted. Instead of hatred, he chose discipline. Instead of silence, he chose inner strength. Even in prison, Mandela continued to grow. He read, he thought, he learned, and he began to understand something very powerful. That freedom is not only physical, it is also mental. Years turned into decades, and Mandela became more than just a prisoner. He became a symbol of resistance, a symbol of hope, a symbol that the human spirit cannot be broken. Outside the prison walls, the world was changing. His name was spreading across countries. People were demanding his release. Governments were being pressured. But inside Robben Island, time still moved slowly. 1 year, then 10, then 20. Yet Mandela remained unbroken. And after 27 long years, something incredible was about to happen. The world would finally hear the words it had been waiting for. Nelson Mandela is free. After 27 long years, the world finally changed. Pressure from inside South Africa and pressure from around the world had become impossible to ignore. The system that once seemed unbreakable was finally beginning to crack. And then, in 1990, the moment the world had been waiting for arrived. Nelson Mandela was released from prison. The gates opened slowly, and a man stepped out who had spent nearly 3 decades behind bars. But he did not step out as a broken prisoner. He stepped out as a symbol of strength. Cameras were everywhere. Crowds were waiting. Millions of people around the world were watching live. And then something unexpected happened. Mandela did not raise his voice in anger. He did not call for revenge. He did not demand punishment. Instead, he chose peace. He chose unity. He chose forgiveness. In a world expecting hatred, he delivered hope. He made it clear that the future of South Africa would not be built on revenge, but on reconciliation. Many people were shocked. After 27 years in prison, how could he not be angry? How could he not seek revenge? But Mandela understood something deeper. That real victory is not defeating your enemies. It is transforming them into a better future. And with that mindset, he stepped into a new chapter of history, not as a prisoner, but as a free man. But his journey was not over yet. In fact, the biggest challenge of his life was still ahead. Freedom was not the end of Nelson Mandela's journey. It was the beginning of something even greater. South Africa stood at a turning point in its history. A nation divided for decades now had a chance to rebuild itself. In 1994, South Africa held its first fully democratic elections. Millions of people stood in long lines, waiting for one simple right, the right to vote. And when the results were announced, history was made. Nelson Mandela became president of South Africa. The same man who once sat in a prison cell now sat in the highest office of the nation. But Mandela did not lead like a man seeking power. He led like a man seeking healing. Instead of dividing people, he worked to unite them. Instead of punishing the past, he focused on building the future. One of his strongest messages was simple: forgiveness is the only way forward. Under his leadership, South Africa began to change. Laws were reformed, rights were restored, hope slowly returned to millions. But what made Mandela truly different was not just his position, it was his mindset. He proved real leadership is not control, it is compassion. The man who suffered for 27 years now dedicated his life so others would not suffer the same fate. And the world realized something powerful. A prisoner had become a president, not by force, but by forgiveness. Nelson Mandela's story is not just history. It is a lesson for every human being. A lesson that begins in suffering, but ends in greatness. He spent 27 years in prison, yet he never allowed hatred to control him. He was isolated, broken from the world, and tested beyond imagination. But instead of becoming bitter, he became wiser. Instead of seeking revenge, he chose forgiveness. Instead of giving up, he held on to hope. And that is the first lesson. True strength is not physical power. It is emotional control. The second lesson is even more powerful. Your circumstances do not define your future. Mandela was a prisoner, but he still became a president. The third lesson: time cannot break a determined mind. 27 years could not destroy his purpose. It only made it stronger. And the final lesson: great leaders are not remembered for power, but for compassion. Mandela did not change the world through fear. He changed it through forgiveness, through patience, through courage, and through belief in equality. His life proves one simple truth: no matter how dark your present is, your future can still shine brighter than anything you imagine. From a small village in South Africa, to a prison cell, to the presidency, Nelson Mandela's journey became one of the greatest stories ever told. And his legacy will live forever, not in buildings or statues, but in the hearts of people who still believe in justice. Because legends never truly die. They become inspiration. If one man can survive 27 years in prison and still choose forgiveness over revenge, then there are no limits to what a determined mind can achieve. Your situation does not define your future. Your struggles are not your ending. They are your beginning. If this story inspired you, don't just watch it, feel it. If you learned something today, hit the like button so more people can see this story. If you believe in stories that inspire real change, subscribe to the channel Epic Scene Hub and comment below. What part of Mandela's journey inspired you the most? Because every like helps this message reach someone who needs hope, and every subscription helps us bring more legendary stories to life. Remember, greatness is not something you wait for. It is something you build. Thank you for watching.